Genetic genealogy is simply a tip. It's a lead generator. It's a highly scientific tip, but it's still just a tip. So we can point law enforcement in the right direction with this technique, but they still have to perform their full investigation.
Genetic genealogy and how it was used in the Idaho 4 murder investigation is becoming a major issue in the case against Bryan Kohberger. And now, court documents reveal Kohberger's defense may claim DNA on a knife sheath was planted. Thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy. We reported a few weeks ago that prosecutors asked the court to issue a protective order on the genetic genealogy information developed by the FBI using a DNA profile obtained from the snap of the knife sheath found on Maddie Mogen's bed. Kohberger faces the possibility of the death penalty if convicted of the murders of Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin last November. The defense wants to show how the FBI used DNA to create family trees that led them to Kohberger and his father. It's clear from reading court documents and from covering the case that law enforcement had very little to go on until genetic genealogy came into play. Kohberger's defense attorneys wrote in their objection that they want to see how many other potential suspects were overlooked. And they even suggested that Kohberger's DNA could have been planted. They wrote, what the state's argument asks this court and Mr. Kohberger to assume is that the DNA on the sheath was placed there by Mr. Kohberger and not someone else during an investigation that spans hundreds of members of law enforcement and apparently at least one lab the state refuses to name. Prosecutors have now responded to the defense's objection, writing, presumably then, defendant was attempting to show how the investigative genetic genealogy information is material to the preparation of his defense when he asserted that someone other than the defendant may have placed his DNA on the Ka-Bar knife sheath. But the state is at a loss as to how that theory supports a claim that the IGG information is material to the preparation of his defense. In other cases, prosecutors haven't been forced to turn over the genetic genealogy information. I spoke with CeCe Moore, an expert in the field, about this earlier this year.
The precedent that we've seen set is that this does not need to and should not be presented in court in front of a jury. So far, it's really been discussed in pretrial hearings, grand jury trial hearings, if at all. I've been on hold for dozens of cases to be an expert witness, and I've been canceled in every single one because of the precedent that we're seeing set, because of the rulings the judges are making. Oftentimes, when the defense tries to object to the genetic genealogy, and they lose, which they have in every case so far, they end up doing a plea deal.
Kohberger's trial is currently set for October. Meanwhile, I spoke with Kristen Slaper, an expert in DNA analysis, who managed DNA analysis for years for Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Crime Lab. I asked her about the possible claim that DNA was planted and the arguments over genetic genealogy.
What's important to remember is that, first of all, DNA on its own doesn't mean anything until you have a standard to compare. So what I mean by that is you could run DNA tests all day long, get profiles from someone or multiple people, and you don't really know what it means until you either put it into the CODIS database or you compare it to a standard that's submitted. So in a situation like this, where I hear that the claim is DNA is planted, I think it's important to remember that Bryan Kohberger was not known. Nobody knew who did this. And I think that's important because in order for something to be planted, it has to be a pretty, it's got to be pretty planned out to plant someone's DNA. You have to have their DNA, first of all. You have to have an item that their DNA is on and know that only their DNA would be found on it in order for a result to be produced the way that it was, for it to be one person on this knife sheath, for it to be enough DNA that you could generate a profile from this, that you could put it into CODIS, that you could then go on to do genealogy. You have to have a decent amount of DNA for that. And so it has to be really carefully planned, I think, if you're going to plant someone's DNA. And then, like I said, not knowing who the person is when the DNA lab runs the test, the DNA lab is only generating what's there and what they have. And we always had a saying in the lab that you either get the right answer or you get no answer. Because you're working the evidence that gets submitted by the law enforcement agency. And sometimes you would get a profile and other times you wouldn't. So in my mind, to plant someone's DNA, I think it takes an awful lot of work. And I think it's a little bit too coincidental with all the other facts of the case. Not knowing the outcome, not knowing who did it, that's just my opinion.
So the state says, they had this unknown DNA profile. As you mentioned, they didn't get a hit in CODIS. So they send it to a private lab. There are a few private labs that will do this work for law enforcement, but then they hand it over to the FBI, and the FBI comes up with this SNP profile. It's a different type of profile from the STR used in the lab. And I think this can get very confusing for people who aren't familiar with this. So they hand it over to them, and then they build family trees based on the information that they are given. And then they kind of hone in on him. But the defense makes it sound like they may have overlooked other potential suspects.
So I think a couple things on that. Yes, what we call a SNP profile or a SNP panel is different from conventional DNA testing. Conventional DNA testing is looking at 20 or 21 locations, depending on which kit you use in the lab. And if you have that profile, you can directly compare it to a standard from a suspect. And you can see, does this exactly match this person or not? When it gets put into the CODIS database, the same question gets asked. Is this matching to someone either at the state level or at the national level in the CODIS database? In a situation like this, where you have a good enough amount of DNA and it's a single source profile, you then can go on to do the SNP testing. SNP testing is, if you've heard of the Human Genome Project and you've heard that they sequence someone's DNA, that's essentially what developing a SNP panel is. It's sequencing the DNA, and then it's looking at certain segments of the DNA and comparing it to people that may be similar or not. The origination of this type of testing was really intended for SNP testing or to determine how similar someone's DNA was to their ancestors. So I submitted my sample to Ancestry, 23andMe, and they could tell me, okay, your DNA is very similar to people that live in Eastern Europe, which I always knew. I always knew that I was Polish. And so, yes, my DNA most likely matches that. That's all SNP testing is doing. It's basically saying your DNA has a lot in common with someone else. And that in the situations of ancestry testing, it's populations from Eastern Europe or Ireland or wherever it's from. In a situation like this, they're taking that SNP panel that was developed at a private laboratory, and it's 700,000 locations on someone's DNA. They upload it in a very similar manner to uploading an STR profile or a normal profile to the CODIS database. They upload this SNP panel or SNP profile to these publicly available databases and then ask the question of how related is the person who owns this profile, i.e. is the DNA from the knife sheath, how related is this person to somebody available in these databases? I think it's important to note that the databases are publicly available databases. So someone took the time to take their sample, their own profile, their own SNP panel, and upload it to say, where are my relatives? Who am I related to? I want to trace my own family tree. I want to see, my own background. So once that comparison, they take the SNP profile, they upload it to that database. Once that's done, the returns that come back are potential family members of this person. And the return it could be a first cousin because of the relatedness and because of the DNA from the evidence profile looking very similar to the person in the database. Because of that, that's how they know the potential relatedness. So once they figure out who's in the database and they find out the identities of those people, again, those people have uploaded their sample. They have given their information. It's public. Once they figure that out, they then develop the family tree. So when you're talking about there could be other potential people, it's probably other relatives of that initial sample that got uploaded. The thing to remember is down the line, they eventually do a direct comparison back to that original DNA profile with 21 locations on it. And it's very discriminating. That profile, again, it's a 1-to-1 match. So even if there are other people in the genealogy database that look related, at the end of the day, they do that final comparison and it's a match.
I also asked Slaper about the prosecution's argument that the FBI doesn't keep reports on the genetic genealogy work performed in this case. Prosecutors say they don't have to turn that material over to the defense and that proper DOJ protocols were followed. Prosecutors cited another case in which the state was not ordered to turn over the information.
I mean, my opinion is that I don't see, I understand they don't want to turn it over because the people who are involved along the way, what I mean by that, the people who are in the database, they gave their stuff willingly, right? They uploaded their information willingly if the FBI used the publicly available databases, GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, which it's everybody's understanding that those are the databases they should be using. So I think what they're trying to prevent is that there's people along the way who are related to Bryan Kohberger at the end of the day that don't need to be harassed. They don't need to be questioned about their DNA because, again, remember, his DNA matches that DNA profile on the knife sheath. So there are private labs that are doing this type of testing, whether it's the SNP panel or the genealogist, and they are providing a report that shows exactly how they got to the answer that they got. So I'm not sure that it's required to turn it over, but at the same time, it probably would make the case, open the doors for here's exactly how they got to the answer that they got to. Understanding that I think they're trying to protect private citizens. But in full disclosure, my opinion is just show what you did and how you got there.
Typically, we've heard about genetic genealogy being used in cold cases. In this case, it was used in a newer case. Does Kristen Slaper believe investigative genetic genealogy will be used in newer cases in the future, where other leads have been exhausted?
I think that this is the way some of these cases are going to go, with the understanding that the genealogy labs and the companies that have those databases, they set parameters for the type of case that is going to be allowed to be searched in those. Also, those companies that have those databases, they require people to opt in to be available to search for law enforcement. But I do think there are many current cases where that comes to mind. It's important to remember that in order to do genealogy, you have to back up a step and you have to have DNA, and that DNA has to be uploaded to CODIS. Given that this type of testing is newer in the field of DNA analysis, there's not as much oversight or regulation as other DNA analysis and the CODIS database. That's regulated by the FBI. So there are groups that are working currently to develop protocols and procedures, whether it's for the lab that's doing the SNP testing or for the genealogists in how they're developing those leads. There are groups that are developing protocols for how that should go, because it shouldn't be a secret. It's not a black box, voodoo magic, whatever. It should be available. But I do think that there are techniques. There's also what we call the familial DNA testing, which uses the CODIS database. And that has been, if you look at around the country, that has been regulated by courts across the country, whether the state is allowed to do it or not allowed to do it. And that was, probably about 10 years ago, that whole idea started. And this is where things have progressed. So I do think that, using family members to find someone's DNA, because we know that DNA is shared. I think that it's not a new concept, but I think it's going to become more prevalent. And especially in a case like this, where you have 4 college students who were killed, and there was a piece of DNA evidence at this, found at the scene where they could do some advanced testing on it.
Bryan Kohberger's lawyers will certainly argue that there was a rush to judgment in this case. They've also hinted that they will question the qualifications of some of the investigators involved. Moscow is a college town that's very small with a small police department. Bryan Kohberger remains in the Latah County Jail held without bail. He'll be back in court August 2nd for another hearing. For Law and Crime, I'm Anjanette Levy.